Welcome back to Radically Rethinking Railways in Australia, with your regular host, the Mad Professor. We're back in the land of pork pies and pints to start this episode on how rail commentators, whether they be enthusiasts or advocates, are too inclined to believe in monsters, and when they believe in monsters, they are likely to be led by the nose. Today's great goblin is not an ethereal spirit being, though he is very dead, and he is very well known. Dr. Richard Beeching. Under his pen, dozens of railways and thousands of stations were condemned to their deaths, and while reports of his death have not been greatly exaggerated, nonetheless you could say the death of the railways under his watch was exaggerated. And this exaggeration mindset can flow through to Australian railways. Australian rail fans, for good or ill, have often had one eye slightly turned to the rail hobby in the UK. And in doing that, they joined the bureaucrats of decades long ago, who definitely aped the British, if not being British themselves. So Beeching's influence is undeniable. And just as the biblical scribe Matthew told us who begat whom, from David to Jesus, your Mad Professor often quotes the begatting that affected Australian rail. Dr. Beeching, as chairman, was protege to Philip Shirley, who served the minister Milton Morris in the early 70s and created the Public Transport Commission of New South Wales. And under his watch, Alan Rye held the position before going on to be chairman of Victorian Railways. And John Hirsch, who you may know from his lobby group Rail Futures, still at it after being CEO of V-Line, after deputising for Rye. So it isn't too much of a stretch to draw a line from Hirsch in our time back to Beeching. But we have other links too. John Elliott, head of the BR Southern region, became consultant to the Victorian Railways during the time of Operation Phoenix, providing truly awful English recommendations rather than truly useful American ones. We will look at the impact of such terrible decisions in future episodes, including one very soon on the use of rail motors for passenger trains. And in our time, we see Englishmen, the likes of Howard Collins of Sydney Trains, flown out from Blighty. What did Beeching do? Well, his first crime, if we can call it that, was he came over from ICI to be chair of the British Railways Board, as a private sector ring-in, rather than a long-term civil servant or railway man. He demanded a salary more like what he had had at ICI, but very unbecoming of a civil servant, and got it. That kept the newspaper headlines going for weeks. It was only later he produced his seminal report, Reshaping Britain's Railways. His report. And while his report spoke about many problems and solutions, it was his nominated branch line closures that took all the limelight. And what a lot of branch lines. The UK had a vast number of railways when Beeching became chairman. Whether you're an Australian or British observer, it's sometimes hard to credit just how many. This map shows a very small patch of the largest island. This area is just to the northwest of London. Large towns shown are outer commuter suburbs, but most of this area is still rural, and in Beeching's time it was all rural. And yet there are 19 separate railways shown here, counting from each junction. Very little traffic being generated within this area, whether we mean passengers or freight. This situation was true over much of the island. How did we end up with so many railways? Most were built with private speculators' money in the earlier part of the 19th century, or were a result of competition between the larger railways in the latter part. For example, in this area, we would see competition between the Great Western Railway, London and North Western Railway, Metropolitan Railway, and others. And some of these are what finance commentators would call strategy plays today, trying to outflank or outfox your rival, even at the cost of building a money-losing line from the start. So nobody should be under the illusion that these lines were all needed. And even at the time, the company directors would have been overplaying their hand. Maybe the case for keeping all of them might have been stronger had London expanded that far. But only even now is there such expansion. And with land use legislation, the likelihood of the unbridled sprawl we saw in the 1920s, which was called Metroland, it won't happen now. So Beeching's report had plenty of lines up and down the country, which failed his Pareto analysis. In other words, were among the 80% of lines generating only 20% of revenue. So what did Beeching get wrong? While many of the lines really were no-hopers, and typically a lightly used branch line from a junction to a terminus might fit that bill, many lines he recommended for closure were cross-country routes from one town to another on different main lines, or even larger cities. Secondary main lines that backed up the major lines. And he recommended far too many lines on the periphery of larger cities, such as the Portishead line in Bristol, lines around Liverpool or Manchester. London was largely spared, and these regional cities were growing in the 1960s and would only keep growing in both population and traffic. So that now what seemed like a quaint branch line might be well in the suburbs of Birmingham or Glasgow. And you don't need your mad professor's opinion of this. You can see it for yourself, with lines being rebuilt today. Going back to our map of Buckinghamshire, despite the fact that most of these lines closed, the remarkable thing is that they're now building railways in this area. From a nadir in the 1970s, the line from Aylesbury to Aylesbury Parkway, north, along the freight-only former Great Central Line, was reinstated for passengers. But more significantly, the direct line from Oxford to Cambridge is now being rebuilt. This line was obviously needed, but was closed in the 1960s, and is now being put back. But the saddest loss in the whole country was the Great Central Line. It provided an alternative route to London from Manchester and Sheffield, but Beeching thought it wasn't needed. And now they are building High Speed 2 line right through the centre of our map, because it turns out they did need more capacity from London to Manchester, Sheffield and elsewhere in the central northern part of Britain. And Buckinghamshire is just a small part. Cross-country line from Edinburgh to Carlisle being put back. The lines out of Newcastle and Birmingham turned over to light rail or metro. Beeching was very wrong in the peri-urban zones. To be fair to Beeching, and many fans are not fair, we should acknowledge that Beeching was not the author of all the branch lines closed in this period, nor were all the lines he recommended actually closed. It was a political decision. Beeching, in fact, was a giant cardboard cutout that politicians on both sides could hide behind while actually closing lines. And in the minds of many of the public, a monster. But he gave form to a set of institutional decisions that would otherwise be abstract and impersonal. Lines had been closing before he wrote the report, and did after it. In our episode 9, Electric Dreams, we looked at the Manchester-Sheffield line via the Woodhead Tunnel, which was a prototype for some schemes in Australia. Unfortunately, much of the line closed, but if we look at that history closely, we can see in fact how Beeching was maligned. He did not recommend closure of this line, but a parallel line, However, that line went through the minister's electorate, and so it was spared, and the Woodhead route allowed to close. In our third episode, Accidental Death of a Railway, we looked in some detail at the Victorian Railways line to Healesville, which had a conspiracy against it that resulted in its eventual closure. We say conspiracy because the circumstances of its closure were a bit contrived. It was losing money, but so were many others at that time, main lines, suburban lines, and others. It needed some work to make it better, but again it wasn't alone, and that work would have made it cheaper to run and lose less money. And the operating efficiencies it also needed would have been straightforward. And that's without looking at opportunities to make even more money from it, by selling the services the public actually wanted. But it was definitely not alone. Hundreds of lines built in Australia have been closed, many thousands of kilometres of route. Without being privy to up-to-date accounting information at the time of closure, your mad professor can't know if any of them stood to make money, but published figures from other periods do not imply the losses were major. And the lines that exist today, whether the New South Wales line from Tamworth to Armidale, or Tarago to Canberra, or the Victorian lines from Maryvale to Bairnsdale, Ballarat to Ararat, or the absolute extravagances in Queensland, with lines to Forsyth, Wallangarra, or Croydon, with really not much at all, at most kept in existence for a few passenger trains a day. The amount these lines would be losing right now would be well in excess of those earlier lines. Not that we're advocating for their closure, far from it. It is just that the political system has a threshold of acceptability for losses. Whether this is a political or electoral calculation, or whatever, is hard to say. But it is a threshold, and for some reason, it was tough at some periods in the past, but not later. But if the political class needs something to move things along, commission a report. You can see why Beeching wanted that salary, not just to keep him in the style he had become accustomed to, but because he was going to be paid to be a public punching bag. And we lose from his report all his positive commitments, some that were lost from the narrative, and some that were never delivered. One was that the rail network be upgraded to have a basic fast express train model, something like the German railways, with a 200 km/h base speed, something that counterintuitively did come to Britain in the 1970s via the HST sets, an El Cheapo way of delivering speed without all the upgrades that Beeching had assumed, going back to the Woodhead Tunnel, or the Great Central, or any number of lines. Do you think it closed when Beeching was chairman? No, of course not. Nor in the time of his political master, Ernest Marples, or his master, the Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. Macmillan would soon lose office, but the Labor PM Wilson and his Transport Minister Barbara Castle still carried out more closures, despite saying in opposition that they wouldn't. And then Edward Heath from the Tories, Callaghan for Labor. Only in the time of Margaret Thatcher was the Woodhead Tunnel actually removed. 5 changes of Prime Minister before the Woodhead Tunnel's fate was sealed. So yes, Beeching was a patsy for the entire political class, Labor and Conservative, who wanted railways closed. Or more likely, they were in turn agents for the Treasury. We talk about Treasury a lot on this channel as being some sort of monster, but it isn't really. It is really just a set of institutional arrangements in government, an end-to-end process that starts with indoctrinating young students at universities into the neoliberal economics cult. These students are then taken into government, where they have to apply the microeconomic and macroeconomic hocus pocus. In reality, the Treasury are not the government's economists, but their accountants. An accountant is there to keep track of the money, not to provide economic advice. Real economics is about efficiency, productivity, getting the most output from limited inputs. Treasury will of course tell the government how much debt they have incurred, and have a valid role in keeping debt moving, retiring old debt, and issuing new debt. We saw in our episode 10, Money, 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 that government debt, and money for that matter, are not really a thing. So Treasury is just a set of institutional policy settings that favour an excessive focus on debt and money rather than economic progress. We are entitled to call out Treasury's wrong thinking, but not everything they say will be right or wrong. If Treasury have been micromanaging rail systems, it's because the actual managers of the rail systems failed to do their jobs. In Britain for nearly 200 years, and in Australia nearly as long. And what could Beeching have done differently? First, Britain lacked the institutional capacity to localise service delivery. It developed it somewhat later in the 1980s, when we had the various public transport executives established in the provinces. Mainland Europe has had a lot of success with local level rail companies. This has the advantage of making local officials accountable through local votes and local taxes for the decisions they make. When Beeching and his political masters were closing small local lines in Scotland, bureaucrats a long way in London were making the decisions. If these lines needed continuing subsidies, then put that to the locals who benefit from it. Another thing Beeching, or these local railways could have done, was really drive costs down through the use of self-propelled rail cars. Better, consider the sort of lower-scale railways that some call light rail, as was done first in Newcastle-on-Tyne with the Tyne and Wear metro system, then in London's Docklands Light Railway, and now various other tramways and other systems around the provinces. Sometimes the best solution for a small-scale commuter system in a city like Manchester, where the suburban trains must terminate at the city terminal, is to run the trains onwards through the city streets, with thinking like in Karlsruhe in Germany. Eventually, as money allows, these systems could be turned into full underground metros or S-Bahns. The UK has its famous Perry People Mover line. Saved the line, and otherwise very high costs it would have incurred. But there were dozens of lines in Beeching's time that needed such a solution. As for the lines themselves, the vast majority were hideously overcapitalised, with sidings, stations, signal boxes, sheds, rolling stock, and so on that were just not needed. The line's precarious financial positions could undoubtedly have been helped if redundant equipment and land could have been sold off. Yes, this might sometimes be tragic from a viewpoint of heritage and culture, but might have helped quite a few lines on the margins. And getting back to heritage, these lines found their way into preservation, especially steam railway preservation, and that is a great thing. And if you recall our thinking in episode 3, Accidental Death of a Railway, this channel makes no distinction between such railways and main rail operators. Whatever works to serve the need. But the transition from Beeching closure to preservation was invariably hard and expensive, and unnecessarily so. Whether out of stupidity or spite, some lines went through a period of disuse, or had equipment removed that was later needed, or land sold off and built on. Bridges were destroyed and tunnels filled in. Much of this needs to be undone at high expense. Arguably Britain's most famous preserved railway, but also Beeching's local one, the Bluebell Railway at East Grinstead, took many years to fully rebuild, as a large cutting along the line was used as a tip. Eventually the volunteers had it removed. The lines in this area, like the ones in Buckinghamshire, are close to London, and may yet be used as commuter lines. One route, from Tunbridge Wells to Lewes, was an alternative route to the main line to Brighton. It has been removed and partly built over, and now they are sorry. Coming back to Australia, some of our issues are the same as Britain, and some are very different. Yet the Beeching monster looms large here too. We didn't exactly have numerous secondary main lines to close, but we did lose lines on peri-urban fringes, and in many cases, people are sorry they are gone. Think Mernda in Melbourne, or the Gold Coast line in Queensland, or more recently the Barossa line in Adelaide. Rather than secondary main lines, there are definitely cross-country lines, like the Cowra route, or the through route from Castlemaine to Maryborough, whose loss, if it isn't being felt now, will be felt later. But did we have a Beeching? In our episode Short Memory, we saw how our political class both cast the evils of rail cutbacks on their opponents, but also create the theatre themselves when they need it. Kennett wanted to be seen as tough on the Victorian railways, but wasn't as tough on them as his opponents in politics and the community made out. Your mad professor thinks Kennett was being used by Treasury goons, but even they are not the monsters either, but as we said, just a set of institutional arrangements. And we saw Nick Greiner wanting to cast his opponent Rand as a crook, but needing to make out he was a pawn of the unions. So he pushed that monster narrative onto an American consulting firm called Booz. They may have put the last nails in the coffin of the old NSWGR. But Rand put the second and third last nails in, and his predecessors, like Milton Morris, did their bit too. Many New South Wales rail enthusiasts developed a hatred of Shirley. Remember him? The Beeching protege in the British Railways. But while he cut some New South Wales services, he left others. He was no Beeching. And in Victoria we had Murray Loney, classic monster, head of the Roads Board. He was better described as the executioner rather than the sentencing judge. Using the Healesville example in the episode Accidental Death of a Railway, the decision had already been taken to close the line when Loney wrote his report calling for it to be formally closed. Not too different from Booz. As we begin to wrap up, it is worth pointing out that really these monsters we create are effective for galvanising the bureaucracy to close those lines when the decision has been made. After all, they are steeling themselves against a community backlash. But the monster archetypes often outlive their usefulness. We don't live in our alternative histories. Can we really imagine a world where some of those Buckinghamshire lines would ever survive? Or lines like Victoria's Peachelba East, or South Australia's Penong line. Like Britain, we lost the opportunity to transfer marginal lines to councils, or community groups, or private companies, or just pass them into volunteer preservation as soon as possible and without vandalising them beforehand. We will look more at the line to Tumut in a later episode. This line ran into the early 1980s with a classic pattern of decline, and yet it had a bizarre postscript, spending some time as a volunteer preserved line, but also being studied for complete reopening for a major freight traffic. Imagine, in that alternative history, that the Tumut and Gundagai councils had been required to take it over if they wanted it. They might have got those volunteers involved early. They might have subsidised some of it from their own rate base. They might have cut the large overcapitalisation that the NSWGR had left them. But most importantly, they might have found that private traffic. Logs into and cardboard out of the Visy cardboard factory. The line might still be running today, though probably quite differently from when NSWGR ran it. But this sort of thinking clashes with those institutional arrangements of the permanent bureaucracy, whether we call it Treasury or the Department of Railways or whatever. A neoliberal cult perpetuating itself, using the textbooks they wrote for themselves. They can't arrive at a logical outcome while they are muddling through. But institutional arrangements are not the same thing as inevitability. All these things are choices, to keep lines open or closed, to subsidise or not, to privatise or not. Not the work of monsters. Next time, in Radically Rethinking Railways, is it fair to build the railway that only workers can use? Most of what we spend on city railways is for 2 short times per day. But what about everyone else? Is it good for them? In Twin Peaks. See you then.